So you are listening to the Informal History Podcast. This is Steph Russell, and I'm here with Liz Wolfson. And we interviewed Hubert and Mary Schwartzentruber. And just to give you a little introduction to them. So Hubert was born in 1929 in Zurich, Ontario. And he was one of a number of young men from the Ontario Amish Mennonite Conference who went on to higher education at Eastern Mennonite College. He was ordained as a minister in the Mennonite Church in 1958. And then he and his wife, June, served at the Bethesda Mennonite Church in St. Louis from 1957 to 1972. And they lived on the 9th floor of one of the buildings in Pruitt-Igoe, and they were both very involved in social justice work and racial justice work, and just really, I feel like, just dug in and really worked hard in their adopted hometown. And they were very active with JeffVanderLou, and he touches on that in the interview. And I know, Liz, you actually have his book with you, and you were going to read a little excerpt from that, but was there anything you wanted to add?
This is Liz Wolfson, another of the podcast hosts and editors of Informal History. I think that Hubert and Mary's story just is such a fascinating window into the activism and community organizing that was happening in St. Louis during the 60s and, the years immediately surrounding, particularly with the JeffVanderLou organization. But also, it's just so interesting, I think, to hear the story of folks who came to St. Louis from other places, but were able to really, dig in and become active contributors to the social justice work that was happening, even though they were not from St. Louis, but really seeing the injustice that was happening here and wanting to work to, to redress that. Yeah, the passage that I wanted to read from Hubert's book, which is titled Jesus in Back Alleys, and is a really nice and insightful overview of his work as a Mennonite pastor and his involvement in a number of social justice movements, not just the civil rights movement in St. Louis, but also movements within the Mennonite Church for greater rights for women to have roles of increased authority, of equal authority within the church, and also on behalf of gay and lesbian LGBTQ Mennonite adherents. And so the book is just a really amazing glimpse into his beliefs and his worldview and that activism. And the particular passage that I wanted to read is, it comes at the moment in the story when Hubert is first approached by Mackler Shepherd, who's well known in St. Louis as an activist, a civil rights activist, and as one of the founders of JVL. And Mackler and Hubert became very close friends, close collaborators. And so this is kind of the moment when Mackler first approaches Hubert and asks him to participate in a march, in a public protest, protesting the police shootings by police officers of several Black youth. I believe this is happening in the summer of 1965. And they're organizing a march on City Hall, on the police headquarters, to demand to speak with the chief of police about these shootings. So this is Hubert Schwartzentruber writing about that moment. I quickly had to make a decision. If I don't go, I argued with myself, then I am giving a message that I am on the side of the oppressor. If I go, I am identifying myself with the oppressed. But if I go, I further reasoned, some people there may not be Christians. There may be communists in the crowd. I grew up having been taught that we must not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. But a word seemed to come to me. You must show whose side you are on. I said to Mackler, I will be there to march with you at 1 o'clock. It was the only right thing for me to do. I needed to listen to the voice of the community in which I lived, prayed, and worked. My assignment was to build a congregation in that community. A congregation that does not reflect the voice of the community is at best a body struggling for survival, and at worst, an enemy of the truth.
Right, and we can drop in the show notes where that book is available. I think it's pretty widely available, and we can drop some other relevant info in there for people who are interested. And just one other quick thing. So Mary was actually here in St. Louis for 2 summers working with Head Start, and she and Hubert crossed paths at that point. So they both have roots in St. Louis somewhat. His are a bit deeper, but but then June died kind of young, and so then they married later after, I think after they had gone back to Canada, and they are in Pennsylvania now. So that's where we Zoomed with them from, they live right outside of Philadelphia. So yeah. Anything else you want to add before we start, Liz?
No, I'm good. Let's get into it.
Okay.
Okay. Hubert, I wanted to just say how much I enjoyed your book. I was fortunate to get a copy, and it's just such a wonderful text.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I would like to echo that. So yeah, and we can start. We can go sequentially. So maybe we can go. Whoever wants to start first, talk about your early life. And we both read Hubert's book, so we have more intel on Hubert. But maybe both of you can talk about your backgrounds just briefly before we segue into St. Louis.
Mm-hmm. Well, I grew up on a farm in Ontario. Was there until I went to college, and I went late to college. So I was 28 when I graduated from college, and got married that same year and started our work in St. Louis. And of course, I grew up on a farm, and I loved the farm, and I loved the cattle and the horses and everything we had. And then landed up in the big city where I knew nobody, and in an all African American community which I had never experienced before. And there I started the best part of my life. Not without some pain, with good friends, making many good friends, but also knowing what it looks like to look into the barrel of a gun, to have a house broken into, to be beaten to unconsciousness. Those were all part of my experience. But as I look back, that wasn't as bad as, or the many good things that I experienced healed all those wounds, if there were any deep wounds.
And Mary, what about you? How did you come to St. Louis?
Okay, I am Hubert's second wife, as you know, and I grew up on a farm in Pennsylvania, and I went to college and got an education degree. And when I started teaching, in the summers I wanted to travel, but I had no money to travel. So I went into what was called voluntary service. And the first year I went to, it was the year that Head Start began. I think it was Lady Bird Johnson's program. And I went to Nashville and taught Head Start there. And that was an all-day program. The children had lunch, stayed there for lunch. And that was the first time I had ever seen anybody guard their food. Like they sat there with their little tray and they had their arms around it. Like they were afraid somebody was going to snatch their food. And I'd never experienced this before. And so, and that again was an all African American community, but it was a very rich experience. And then my second year of teaching, again, I wanted to go into voluntary service. And so that was when I came to St. Louis. So I was there for two summers in St. Louis and lived above the church on Dayton Street. There were two ladies who shared their apartment with the VS ladies who came. I don't know where the gentleman, the young men slept, I don't know, downstairs or something, someplace else, but they were nearby as well. So, yeah. And again, I worked in what was considered Head Start there at Bethesda.
And that's when you two first crossed paths, was in St. Louis, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So, go ahead, Hubert.
I was there for 15 years. And then I worked for the church-wide position with the Mennonite Church in doing peace and justice education with congregations.
Hubert, could you maybe talk a little bit about how the Mennonite Church came to have a presence in St. Louis?
Well, I think the denomination, pardon me, was becoming active in going to the cities to start new congregations. And of course, St. Louis was one of them. And so they had sent a person there, a retired minister, who went to see what opportunities there would be in St. Louis. He got around in the city a bit and he came to Pruitt-Igoe Housing Project. Do you remember Pruitt-Igoe at all?
Not personally, but I'm very aware of its history.
Mm-hmm.
And so he just said, that's where we ought to start a church. And so he was there about a year before we came. He had gathered a little group of people together for a little worship service. There might have been 8 or 10 adults and maybe that many children when we came. The first Sunday we were there, went to church, and they said, well, now you take over. And here we were, as green as the greenest grass, and had no clue what in the world we were doing. And we had this task before us. And so we had and I think one of the good things was that I didn't know anything. I had to listen to the people. I had to hear what the people were saying. They didn't care so much what I was going to say. They wanted somebody to hear them. And so out of that, a congregation grew, and we left with a congregation of about 175 people. I was deeply involved in community activities. There was an organization called JeffVanderLou. I don't know if you came across that name or not. Mm-hmm. I was part of that to begin with. One day the mayor's office called me and said, we're starting a beautification program that was under Lyndon Johnson. His wife was the push behind that. And the mayor said, there are 19 wards in the city. We want to appoint a committee in each ward to do the beautification. The beautification had to do with painting fences and cleaning sidewalks and doing some other little decorations which didn't amount to anything. But when the mayor invited me to be chair of the 19th ward, I said yes. I didn't have no clue what I was doing, of course. And then we started an organization. Do you know the name Mackler Shepherd?
Yes, that was my next question, was to have you talk about Mackler Shepherd.
Yes, Mackler really was the leader, and I just simply stood in and played the role, because I didn't know what was going on in the community. Mackler did, and to this day, there was nobody that in the whole world that I admired more than Mackler Shepherd, and they invited me to come back to do his funeral, and I loved him very much. He helped me. He was like a mentor to me.
So how did you guys cross paths? Can you talk a little bit about how you met and who he was?
Mackler?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he was a leader in the community already, but he was not on the, he had confronted the powers that be, and so they didn't trust him, or they didn't want him. And so I guess they thought, well, this preacher down there on Dayton Street, he doesn't know anything, let's get him. I don't know what they thought. And but Mackler was the leader, even though I had the title for a little while.
But he started out with an upholstery shop. That was his business. And then how did you meet him?
Well, I had already met him quite a while before. We used to sit in the upholstery shop with him, and we'd go and have coffee together, and became a good friend.
And that shop was sort of a hub of the neighborhood a bit, right?
Right.
Yeah, it was more than an upholstery shop.
It really was. It was a meeting place for everything that was going on. Sort of started in that shop.
Hubert, could you maybe say a little bit more about maybe the kind of nature of the tussle or conflict that Mackler had kind of with the powers that be, as it were, that you mentioned? What was maybe some of the topics that they struggled over?
Well, I'm not sure what they all were, but it was Mackler advocated for some justice programs in the area, some renovation of housing, and trying to update the welfare system, which was destroying people. There were those issues that he was concerned about, and they were all political issues. And the powers that be didn't want to talk about those.
And also the abuse by policemen. Would that have been one of them?
Yeah, there was. The first funeral that I did was where a young guy was shot by the police. And as I remember, if I can think back, I must have done at least 10 funerals for murder victims. Some were shootings, some were other kinds of, well, most of them were shootings.
So I wanted to ask in particular, there's this very moving scene in the book, which we can put some information in the show notes for this. It's called Jesus in Back Alleys. And people should read it if they want to read more about your journey here in St. Louis. But there's a very pivotal, very moving scene, and you probably know what I'm thinking of. It's 1965, where you make this huge decision to go out in the streets with Mackler, right? And march and go down to police headquarters. And that scene is just, it was just such a huge pivotal thing in the book, and it was very moving. And I wanted to ask you about that experience.
Well, I still remember it very much. I was in the church doing something, I don't know what, and Mackler came by and said, "We're having a march downtown to the police station. Would you march with us?" And of course, I wanted to say no, but I couldn't say no. I said, "Yes, I'll go." And then I walked I walked with a group. There might have been about 100. I was the only white person in the march. We were going down Jefferson Street. I think it was Jefferson, maybe Delmar. No, I think Jefferson. And we passed a tavern, and there was a big burly man standing at the door. And all of a sudden, he spotted me, and he called back to the people in the tavern. Look at that stupid preacher coming by, walking with them today. Well, that was the biggest compliment I ever got. I would finally felt that I was now part of the community. And so I walked with him that day. And then after that meeting, I said to Mackler, maybe we should get together and all talk about this experience and invite neighbors in. And so Mackler thought it was a good idea. I said we could meet at the church. And so we had the meeting that evening. The church was full, packed full. It wasn't a large church, maybe 110 people could get in. And that was then the beginning of JeffVanderLou. And that's when Mackler became the leader, and I was Mackler's supporter, even though I still had the name leader sometimes.
Would you say that was your entrance to the community as well?
Yeah, that was my baptism into the community.
Could you maybe talk a little bit about what JeffVanderLou was and the work that organization did?
Yeah, well, you know how it got the name from the streets. Vander, Jefferson, St. Louis Avenue, and another one I can't remember.
That would be it. Mm-hmm.
And it was, say again what you had wanted me to say.
Oh, I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the work that that Mackler and yourself, together with the community did in JeffVanderLou.
Yeah, well, we started by rehabbing houses. Then I was able to get some money from the Mennonite church to buy a few of these old houses and to rehab them. And then I was able to get rehab, and maybe you're familiar with it, Mennonite Disaster Service. They're available when there's a disaster like storms or floods or something. So I got Mennonite Disaster to come and bring people to help to restore the houses. And that program lasted for maybe 3 years. I don't know how many came, but there were a lot. They used to say Aretha Spots' house. You know the name Aretha?
I've heard that name, but I'd love to hear more about her. She was a teacher, right? She taught?
She was one of the first leaders, Mackler, and she and I were, I think there's in one of the buildings, there's a little monument or something that has our names on. Do you know where that is?
No, I would, yeah. Where could we find it?
It's one of the high-rise apartments. I don't know if it's on Leffingwell, maybe about in the 2900 block, either Leffingwell or one of those streets. Some place between Dayton Street and Delmar, I think, or between Franklin.
We'll have to look into that.
Yeah. I've only seen it once.
I think there are portraits on the wall, and I think there's one of Mrs. Spots, Aretha Spots, yeah.
So what was her role? Well, I'm very curious to hear more about her and the role she played in GVL.
She was just a very active and wise person. When she spoke, I listened very carefully because she had a lot of wisdom and a lot of energy. and wasn't afraid to speak out. And I admired her. And I know we were happened to be traveling through St. Louis. I don't know where I was going. We spent a night in St. Louis, and we discovered that she had died. So I was able yet to get to her funeral. It was down in 12th Street someplace.
I wanted to also bring up the name Cecil Miller, because that's another important name to put out there, right? Did
Right.
you touch on Cecil a bit?
Yeah. Cecil and his wife Judy came to be involved in being a support to the congregation and also be involved in the community. So they both taught school for a while, but lived on Dayton Street, across from the church down a few houses. I don't think that house is there anymore, I'm not sure. And so he got to know Mackler, and then Mackler needed somebody in the office to help him to keep organized, and Cecil took that position and then worked with him for a good many years. And Cecil still comes back there now. You should try and make contact with him when he comes. And I don't quite know who to tell you to check with.
Have you met him, ladies?
Not yet, but I'm sure we will. Yeah.
I hope so. Yeah.
So you know who I'm talking about.
Yeah, I know he comes back. There was another name I wanted to bring up, another very important person, who's Helen Robinson. She's important to mention as well, right?
Yeah, Helen was a member of our church, and there was a Northside Team Ministry that worked in Pruitt-Igoe Housing Project. Do you have any information on that?
On which piece?
The Northside
Team
Ministry.
Oh, we should probably touch on that, because I'm not sure. I don't have a background in that, and I think that would be an important thing to touch on during this interview, actually.
So, and Helen could be very helpful there.
Mm-hmm.
There were four pastors, a Baptist, a Methodist, a Lutheran, and a Episcopalian, that their denomination had hired them to do ministry in Pruitt-Igoe. And Helen then became their secretary. And I was involved somewhat with them too, but we were two different groups, but we worked together very closely.
Hubert, I wonder if you could maybe talk a little bit more about Pruitt-Igoe when you moved in, and just what was life like in Pruitt-Igoe?
Well, I don't think I want to live it over again, but I'm glad I did. Pruitt-Igoe had about 13,000 people in about 24 high-rise apartments. I think they were 11 stories high. And when we came there, we had an apartment right in the middle of it. We lived there for a couple of years, and that apartment became available above what is now the church. And so we moved over there, but I continued to spend a lot of time in Pruitt-Igoe. I remember I was making some calls one time, and I was walking from one side through a hallway to the other side past an elevator. At the elevator, 3 men were standing looking at the elevator. And I walked past them, and as soon as I had my back turned, I got a blow on the head. And of course I fell and my back on the floor. I was still a little bit conscious, but I could see that gun pointing in my face. And then I felt him going through my pockets, looking for money, I guess. I felt a bit sorry for them. They only got 35 cents for all their work. That's all the money I had. But then as they were going through my pocket, a man from next door heard the racket going on, and he came out, and then the guys ran. And that was the last I heard of them. But then the police were called, and they took me to the hospital, and I had a headache for a couple of days after, but I survived. It's one of those experiences I wouldn't want to go through again. But I think it was a good learning experience. I probably needed it.
And it was significant what the policeman told you then to protect yourself.
Well, yeah, the police said I should be carrying a gun.
But also the clerical collar, right? That became sort of a, yeah.
That's right. Well, I did wear my clerical collar. I don't think I had my clerical collar on then. But after that, I started wearing a clerical collar when I was out in the community.
I guess I wonder about the relationship that Pruitt-Igoe had to the kind of broader community that you were a part of, you know, and that you, that you served. I mean, obviously Pruitt-Igoe was sort of your landing spot when you first came to St. Louis, and you continued to work there even after you and June, found an apartment elsewhere. What was that kind of, I guess, relationship like? What was the role of that, of Pruitt-Igoe within the community?
Well, there was a lot of conflict there. When we came, we drove into St. Louis, and we stopped and asked the policeman for directions to find Pruitt-Igoe. He said, "You don't want to go there." And then I persuaded him, well, what were we going to do? And so he gave me directions, and we went there. I think he was right. Maybe we should not have gone. I don't know. But we went, and were there for 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to ask too, I know June had quite a role in terms of advocating for women's, like a role of women in the ministry. She was quite vocal about that stuff. And I wanted to make sure we touched on that.
Yeah, yes, she was very much so. She, she gave leadership all the children's programs we had. Plus, she also became a counselor to other women in the area, that they respected her and came to her, and she ministered as much as I did. And she just was deeply involved. However, she had a health problem, and her energy was limited. And so it was a bit harder for her to do what she would have liked to have done. Mm-hmm. But she would have, I think I was more ready to leave than she was, but she liked it there. I did too.
And then when you were involved in the broader church, then June went with you, and she preached different times, didn't she?
On occasions, yeah, she did.
Yeah. Which was unusual for a woman at that time in the Mennonite church. Yeah.
But she then was secretary for I don't know what the organization was, and I worked for Mennonite Board of Missions with a role as secretary for peace and justice. And so my work there for 7 years was to be available to congregations, to plan for the congregation, how they can become involved in a more deeper way in peace and justice in their community.
Mm-hmm. And Steph, go ahead.
No, it's your turn.
Well, since you had mentioned your and June's, ultimate decision to leave St. Louis and take up roles within the church elsewhere.
Mhm.
Knowing how sort of intense your work within the community was, I wonder if you could just speak a little bit about that process, by which you and June did decide to leave St. Louis, and sort of just where you both were, in your lives at that time and in your work.
Well, my energy was about completed. I just needed a break for a while. I felt I couldn't give the kind of leadership that the community needed anymore. I was just completely wore out. And June had a bit more energy left, even though she didn't have good health.
Okay. But were you called by the mission board before you left, or did you?
Yes,
Yeah.
I was invited. In fact, in all my ministry, I never applied for a job. I always through invitations.
Mm-hmm. So I wanted to take one tiny step back into St. Louis in our timeline. And Liz and I were both really curious about your children's experience in St. Louis, because they went to city schools, and you touch on that briefly in the book, but I was wondering if you could touch a little bit on their experience here in St. Louis.
Well, I think one of our biggest concerns was what will it do to the children if we take them out of the schools there? They had good experiences there. I think they were the only white children in the school that maybe there were one or two other white kids there, but not very many. They had good experiences. And of course, we tried to provide also the best support that we could give them. But they're both actively employed now.
And what school, if you recall, which schools did they go to in St. Louis?
They went to, we had moved then out on Clarence Avenue, and then they went to a school there. I can't even think of the name of it. I don't know why I can't think. It was a pretty big school.
It's just always a question. I know, even though I'm not originally from St. Louis, asking where people went to school is always
right.
Yeah.
And Mary, I'd love to hear, when you came, and were teaching with the Head Start program here, what was that experience like for you? And what did you observe during that time?
Okay, I think as I remember, one of the tenets of Head Start was to work on attitudes of children, especially, African American children who didn't have contact with people of other cultures, and a lot of attitudes toward authority, because one of the things we did first was ask questions, to get to know them a little bit, and then we had this I can't remember. It was a series of maybe a dozen questions. What does your mother do? What does your father do? Or what does a father do? What does a policeman do? And invariably they said, shoot you. And the mothers and the dads whooped you. And I can't remember all the other things, but nothing real positive about authority. And then, of course, we wanted to work on academics, and the children had not heard stories, hadn't been read to generally, or didn't know nursery rhymes to prepare them for reading, or colors or numbers or number concepts and so forth. So, we did a lot of experiential kinds of things with that. And then we did an assessment again after the 8 weeks. And we didn't make huge strides, but it was just I felt very good about it, because I think a lot of them relaxed. The children relaxed among the teachers, and we had hired young people from the community to work with the Head Start program as well. And that was really a good experience for me to get to know them. One of the experiences I remember, I don't think Hubert has it in his book or anything, was there would be block workers who were the young people, and they, in the afternoons, they would work with the older children and do activities and so forth. And I remember we went to the zoo. We took a lot of children to the zoo, and the block workers and the other leaders were supposed to be in charge of X number of children, and I must have had 6, I guess, young men. They were, well, I guess, no, I think they were all boys, and they were like in 5th grade. And we went to the lion house, and it was pretty dark in there, and the hallway was dark, but the lion pen was not dark at all. And so I realized these lions were just growling and growling. And every time I'd been to the zoo, the lions were very docile. Well, the kids that we had were throwing stones at them. And the guards were coming around saying, "No, you got to get out of here. These kids are irritating these lions." And the kids really didn't listen to me. I don't know if it was because I was a white woman trying to tell them what to do or what, but but we did go on to the next animal, and it was so interesting. But what was also interesting was we took the parents who wanted to go along to the zoo with us. And I don't know, I'd be safe to say that a number of them had never been to the zoo and had never seen a gorilla. And they were so impressed and to the sort of the human characteristics that some of the animals had, especially of the gorillas and so forth. And so I found that very interesting, part of my learning curve too. And I think after the summer VSers left, then they started a winter program with Head Start, didn't they?
Yes, they did.
And Miriam Hirschberger was the teacher then. And Miriam didn't have a college degree, but she had a whole lot of common sense and was extremely creative, artistic, and so she just delved right in. And the school somebody did a survey as to the children's progress when they left the Bethesda preschool program and went to the area schools. And the Bethesda children always came out a little higher in their academic skills, being ready to read and the number concepts and so forth. And so I felt really good about, that was our program. That was great. Mm-hmm.
Oh, I know what I wanted to ask about the documentary Phoenix Rising, right? Because that's something we should touch on as well. The JVL documentary. Yeah.
All right. Now, was that just presented?
No, because the virus happened and the GRIO was going to screen it, and then we had to shelve it, or they had to shelve it. Yeah. So it's delayed.
Okay.
Screening is delayed, but I know, Hubert, you were interviewed in that documentary, correct?
Mark was here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, yeah, we can skip on. Sorry, I kind of lost my thread here just a little bit. I have a more philosophical question, and part of this was as I was reading the book, and I was reading the section about the march down to police headquarters, actually, I was very struck by how we are still having these conversations now, just how contemporary that section of the book felt. And I wanted to get your reaction to that. Like, how is it we're still having these conversations years later? It just feels sometimes like we never make any progress. And I mean, we do, but we don't. It's almost like it feels like we go one step forward and 3 steps back, or hopefully 2 steps forward and 1 step back. I don't know, but I feel like, as having been a part of history and still witnessing it, I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I know that's true, that the problem, we didn't solve all the problems, and they're there yet and probably will be for the next generation. But I don't know whether I think we have to be encouraged by what we did, what we could when we had to, and then maybe the next generation will have to work it again and do it their way. I don't know.
But you do see a rise in racism, do you not?
Well, yeah, I think racism is on the uprise. And I think our whole political system is very fragile right now. Then with the virus yet on top of it.
Yeah, I mean, I understand, why you would say that. And, as someone who, lived through the 1960s and the civil rights movement, and who I believe met Martin Luther King Jr., is that correct?
Yes, I did. I had breakfast with him one morning.
That's amazing. We should definitely talk about that. But I guess I think, for people my age, I was born in the early 80s, and, I was sort of raised, with the idea that, through the civil rights movement, and the work that was done and the achievements that were made, we had sort of left, the problems of racism behind us, in the past. And so, to hear a leader, and someone who was there, and participated, in that, observe that you see racism as on the rise, and, insurgent is, I'm just struck by that.
We live in a retirement community now, and it's basically all white people. And I'm sort of afraid to talk too much because I don't know where people are at. I think a good many are still back in the 60s someplace with their racist outlook.
So speaking of Dr. King and that breakfast, could you say a little bit about that experience and how that came about?
Well, I don't know. I think, there were a few other pastors, and he already had bodyguards with him then, so we didn't get too much personal talking to him, but he addressed us, and I was very impressed with his attitude, the wisdom that I felt that came from the man, and just to be in a room with him, that even was inspiring.
I can imagine. Oh, to be a fly on the wall.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to also touch, I mean, you've been involved in a lot of different fights for social justice, and just briefly, I wanted to touch on Germantown Parish, because that was another big turning point for you in terms of, yeah.
I was overseer for the congregation when a few people decided they're not good enough anymore to be part of the conference. That was one of my hardest things in all my years of ministry. Looking in the barrel of a gun wasn't particularly nice, but working with the structures that were, in my estimation, were not living out what they believed by their judgmental attitude and their racism, and that was very hard on me. Germantown is now a growing congregation, but they're not members of the conference anymore.
And they were disenfranchised because they allowed LGBT folks to worship. And is that correct?
To be members,
yeah.
To be members of the congregation.
Mm-hmm. So what I'm interested in how, people in a faith tradition can respond to these things. It feels like it often has been, faith traditions that answered this call for social justice. And I think maybe in more recent years it's been secularized, but I think there's such a long tradition of churches calling for justice. And I mean, you see this happening a bit more with, for instance, like the Reverend William Barber and the Poor People's Campaign and things like that. But it feels like it's on the resurgence a bit.
Yeah. I just don't know how to respond. Our leadership, and I'm talking about our church, which I know best, and I think it's probably true in other churches too. The leadership in the church has not had opportunity to experience what it's like out there in the world. And so I guess I have to be a little sympathetic with them. They really do, or from my point of view, they really don't know what the issues are. And they're so deeply engrossed in their fundamentalist theology that they can make a case for their position. I don't know how to put that all together.
But it does seem like, because this comes up in the book as well, it seems like the power of experience is something that you speak to a lot, and the way that coming into contact with people who are different from yourself, who come from different walks of life, that's a really transformative experience to have. I guess I wonder how you think about how more people can have those kinds of experiences. Should people have more experiences, sort of as a motor perhaps for social justice?
Well, I think it's probably more difficult now than it was then when I started my ministry. And I don't know why I'm saying that, but it just seems to me that our institutions are sort of locked in their theology, and not very much room for change. And I sometimes wonder what I would be like today had I not had that opportunity to be in social justice ministry. I don't know if I would have stayed at home on the farm. which I sometimes thought I should have, I would be a very different person, I'm sure.
Or maybe not. Is there anything else that, well, I know that St. Louis was very core to that transformation, and I know you still have sort of a soft spot for the city in your heart.
Very much.
Yeah.
I think my second hardest work that I did was being an advocate for acceptance of gays and lesbians in the church.
Mm-hmm.
That almost destroyed me.
Well, we thank you for, your advocacy and your years of work, for those of us who are likewise invested, I really thank you. And speaking of the soft spot that St. Louis still holds in your heart, you mentioned in your book that you still root for the Cardinals, and that was in 2002. And I would love to know if you are still rooting for the Cardinals.
We are still on top of the list.
That is an excellent question and an excellent answer.
Yeah. The Cardinal organization gave courtesy passes to all the pastors. And so I had this courtesy pass for all the time I was in St. Louis.
So you got to go to the old Busch Stadium then?
Yes. We couldn't afford to do anything else, and it didn't cost us anything to go there. So that's what we did.
Mm-hmm. Not a bad way to spend the time,
So
Yeah.
it was very helpful for me.
I'm sure.
Is there anything else anything we've glossed over, or anything that would be good to touch on as we're wrapping things up? Anything we've missed, or anything you just want to say?
Oh, I can't think of it. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're doing.
Oh, well, go ahead, Liz.
I am one of the editors for the Informal History publication that's in the works. And just sort of more broadly, I work in education. I have a PhD in American Studies that I recently completed. And so I'm still involved in higher ed teaching, and, doing my own research. And I also run an art gallery here in St. Louis called Floodplain.
Good.
What's it called?
It's called Floodplain. It is on the south side of the city. It's just off Gravois on Cherokee Street. So we do have a website. If you do a Google for Floodplain St. Louis, I'm sure we'll pop up. And we do both art exhibitions, and we host a lot of live performance, music, poetry, things like that. So
Wonderful. Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Yeah.
So I'm tag teaming the editing with Liz, and Mark is involved, obviously. So we were working on the print version of our little project, and then when the virus hit, that got very complicated, and we were going to do the podcast anyway. But this just seems to fit the moment in terms of, everybody's on Zoom right now. So we thought, okay, we'll lead with the podcast and do all these wonderful interviews with people, including the both of you. So I worked at St. Louis Magazine for 13 years, and Liz was my writer. So I used to be Liz's editor. She's a wonderful writer. And I work at a school now in the publications department. So I do a lot of proofreading. Not quite as exciting as being out in the world writing stuff, but it's nice. I like being around kids. It's high school kids and junior high kids are they provide all the excitement. They're just little balls of energy. And I still freelance, and I actually live not that far from the former Pruitt-Igoe site. I'm in St. Louis Place. And so, so yeah, when you're talking about a lot of these streets and landmarks, although I moved here in 2001 from Salt Lake City, so a lot of the St. Louis that I hear about from other people, it was long gone before I got here. But St. Louis is such a beautiful, complicated, heartbreaking city. There's just so many layers. And so anytime, you know, there's the opportunity to talk about the history and especially JVL, like the little that I know about it now, like through Mark and through talking to you guys, it sounds like that organization was just like a model organization in terms of the kinds of work it was doing in the community. I'm just blown away by what was accomplished, and that it's not more out in the collective, that more people don't know about the kind of work that was being done. So I'm really glad for Mark's push to, like, for doing, you know, this interview, for instance, and highlighting the work that the both of you did. I mean, I feel like I don't want there to be amnesia around this kind of work. It's just so important. And I do think that, I mean, like reading Hubert's book, and I mean, it's having those examples and having that hope that that kind of work can be done, I think it's a huge deal. At least that's how I feel. It's helpful and inspirational and quite wonderful. So anyway.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I really, you know, I think I'm always looking for, you know, role models, you know, as some folks say, you know, our forebears, you know, our forebears in the struggle, and the examples, you know, of folks who were engaged in this work, you know, before, you know, folks like I, you know, showed up on the scene, and to know that, you know, we're not inventing the wheel. You know, the cart was rolling well before, you know, we
got to get behind the cart and push.
Yes, exactly. And that's the work of each subsequent generation, you know, to get behind the cart and push. But, you know, understanding how the pushing happened, you know, before you came is so important, I think. And, you know, as I was reading your book, I was just so inspired, you know, by your stories of courage, you know, like, you know, really like when you decided to go on the march with Mackler, you know, you know, and just, you know, struggling with, you know, should I do this? Is this safe? You know, I think those are questions that we all have to ask ourselves at some point. But as you said, you know, you kind of have to ask yourself, like, which side are you on? You know, how do you identify? And, you know, those questions are always relevant. So it was helpful for me to hear that.
If I would not have gone with Mackler that day on that march, I doubt whether I'd still be alive. I think I found my way in the community, and the community protected me.
Yeah. It's very beautiful.
Could I make a comment about what I think is one of the legacies of the Church of Bethesda?
Please.
It probably comes up in his book, but I you know, it's been a while since I've read it, but there was a young people's group that would gather, well, of course they gathered Sundays, but they gathered Friday night, and they'd come over in the middle of the week, and they'd just sort of hang out. But Friday night was game night, and the kids would get together and play games. And Miriam and Dave Hirschberger were really pivotal in gathering them. They often welcomed them in their home, and Miriam was a wonderful cook, so she would make treats for them, which they all loved, of course. But the significant thing about this youth group is that some of those people still call Hubert. Like, you know, they'll call him on his birthday or at Christmas or something. And one of them, one or two are in Texas and one's in California, and I don't know where the others are. But this also significant that none of them landed up in jail, which was sort of what happened to especially a lot of the young African American young men. They get in trouble and so forth. And so I just found that the youth group was really significant. One of the young ladies is a dentist and lives in California, and I don't know, the others have their own business or whatever. And there was a quartet of the young men, four young men. One was Lonnie Taylor, and can't remember all the other.
Robinson.
Who? Robinson?
Dwayne Robinson.
Dwayne, yeah. And they sang a song that it was a popular youth group sang it, called "What Color Is God's Skin?" And it's just it was just really a very significant song for them to sing. And they would go out to other Mennonite communities. They would be taken along and for the part of the churches, saying who this is, what we are, and what we're doing, and so forth. And the other thing that I wanted to mention was, I don't know if you've heard much about Jessie, who was Mackler's wife.
No.
Jessie, okay. She was a classy lady. She had a beauty shop in her backyard. I don't know if it's still there behind Mackler's property or not. But I don't know what's there on Mackler's property.
I think the house, I don't know if the house is there anymore or not.
I don't know. Mark would probably know. But anyway, she had this little shed back there, and that was her beauty shop. And she said that her goal was to make the young ladies as pretty as any of the other kids who went to the school. She said they will look as good, and they did. She just made sure that they all had opportunity to really be as beautiful as they possibly could. And when I don't know how old she was, maybe mid-50s, or maybe when she turned 50, she told me she went and got a facial once a month because she felt she was worth it. And I said, well, Jessie, you really were. And she was, if you could find a picture of her someplace, she was just a beautiful lady. Yeah. So.
Thank you for mentioning that. That's a wonderful anecdote. And so her name, one more time, Jessie. So Jessie Shepherd. Okay.
Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. Can you tell them more about her? Yeah.
No, you told them what.
Yeah. Okay. Well, she got cancer, and she had 3 dogs. I think 3 big dogs, didn't she?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and she was in her, I remember part of the story, we went to visit her when she was sick, and these dogs would stay with her upstairs, and when she needed Mackler to come up and bring something or whatever, she would send one of the dogs down and say, go get him, as she called him. And he did. They did. It was just really touching.
And did Mackler and Jessie, did they stay in St. Louis for their, throughout their lives?
Yes, they did.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you guys stayed in touch?
Yes, we did.
Yeah, yeah. And then, well, after I married Hubert and moved to Ontario, we did some tour guiding for one of Hubert's friends, had a tour company called Tour Imagination. And I remember that was one of the first years we were married. We took a tour to Jamaica. And so we invited Jessie and Mackler to go with us. And they were the only African Americans, I think, with us.
Mm-hmm.
And the rest were friends from Ontario or from some of my friends from Pennsylvania. Well, Jessie loved going to the markets in Jamaica. And she came back with all kinds of things, and I don't think she paid for them. I think she just charmed the people, and well, maybe she probably gave them something, but she charmed the people here and there. It was just really interesting. she would sit down on one of their chairs and just talk to them. I mean, everybody else went to bargain, but not Jessie. She was very, very special woman. So yeah. Yeah. And I don't know, in Hubert's book, does he have the part that Mackler was invited by Jimmy Carter to be part of was it Jimmy Carter?
Yeah, Jimmy Carter had invited him to be on a committee to work at racial justice.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Yeah, no, that's amazing. So was that work that he went to Washington, D.C. to be a part of?
Yes.
I think it was also to work on a model like JeffVanderLou. Is that right?
That was part of it too.
Yeah, JeffVanderLou. Somehow that became known, and this model, they wanted Mackler to come and work, in Washington. Yeah.
Wow.
I remember a busload of people came from Washington one time to see what JeffVanderLou is doing, and we took them around to see some of the work, and they were amazed that a group of just plain city people could do that.
Wow.
And that's why they wanted to use it as a national template.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So why did that not happen? I mean, I drive through JVL now, and knowing what I know, it's kind of painful to drive through JVL because it didn't stick, and I'm wondering what happened there.
Yeah, I don't know. It just didn't happen. I think the powers that be had more power than the people that wanted to make the change.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like the JVL project didn't find the support within the kind of local power structure that perhaps it would have needed to be able to kind of, stick around.
Yeah, I think that's right. And yet they were doing, they had to also respect it because there was a lot of political power there too for the city, because here was a group of people that were getting something done, and they had to take that seriously too.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Well, when Washington takes notice, I mean, that's a little further up the food chain than the local aldermanic system. So yeah.
I remember for that project to do some cleaning and stuff, beautification committee, the mayor, we had started already sweeping alleys and stuff and had a good bit of stuff going already. And then the mayor called me one day and said, we'd like to have a opening ceremony for the big sweep, they called it. And we'd like to come down into your community to do it. And of course we said that would be fine, we'd be glad to have you. So they came over on Dayton Street. They set up, they had the platform of a truck, I think, for a truck to be their platform for the big event. The mayor was there, a lot of people had gathered, and then the mayor had made a broom. It was about 2 feet long, the broom was, the broom part. And this was the big sweep that was going to be made. And so the mayor made his little speech, and then he went through the motion of the big sweep. And he put the broom over his shoulder and made the sweep. When the sweep hit the floor, the broom hit the floor, the broom broke.
Oh no.
It was such a good example of the whole project.
That's great.
And I said to the mayor afterward,
that was Cervantes, right? That was Mayor Cervantes?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I said to him, why don't you walk with me and we'll go over to our little meeting place where the community group meets. well, yeah, I'd like to do that. So we took him through some of the worst alleys that were there. We walked through the alleys to get to the church, and every once in a while he snuggled up to me. It's safe. He says, okay for me here? Quiet. Then we got to the little storefront that we had started and had a little conversation, but he wasn't very happy.
What, I'm just curious, what was he, I mean, was he not happy because his broom broke, or, you know, I mean, what did he have to?
He didn't quite get the reception, I think, that he expected to get. Plus, he didn't know that the community was as bad as it was. That's going through those alleys. I think that just turned him off. I don't know what all was going.
Got it.
Spur him to action a bit? I mean, seeing the alleys and being in the community, did that help at all? It sounds like it didn't, but maybe it inspired him to act a little bit more in terms of supporting the community?
Yeah, I think it did. I know that his office was open to us anytime we wanted to come. And I know I was in City Hall a couple of times, and his store was open, and when he saw me, he'd come out to talk to me. So he must have had some respect for us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But he didn't have, what could he do? I mean, he was in a political tightrope kind of stuff. That
because it's an ecosystem. Like not even the mayor lives in a void. We're all connected to each other, and we have to answer to each other. And when you're in politics, you have to answer to a lot of people. So I hear what you're saying.
yeah. But the world goes on, and with this virus that we have, who knows what it's going to look like in a year from now.
Right.
With this epidemic we're going through.
Mm-hmm. That's definitely true. I mean, you know, it's seems like it's really transforming so many parts of our lives, you know, day by day, and
Yes.
a lot of uncertainty. I hope you both are staying safe. It sounds like y'all are in a good spot. So
We think so.
Yeah.
Well, it's been lovely to talk to you guys. This was
It's been good to talk to you.
Yes.
yeah. Well, when it's safe to come out from our little houses, we can maybe like all of us get in a car and come up and say hi or something.
that would be wonderful.
Yeah.
You should do that.
We would love to have you come. Absolutely. Yes.
It would be so great to meet in person. We can bring you some fresh Cardinals gear.
Yeah.
That would be good.
We'll refresh your look a little bit with the latest swag, as the kids say.
Totally. Yeah. So.
It's been so nice chatting with you.
Thank you. This was lovely. Thank you guys so much for
Thank you so
generous
much
with your time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we'll be in touch with the podcast episode when it's up and all of those kinds of details.
Yep.
Oh, good. So lovely to talk to you too. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Now how do I do this? There you go. Okay. Here, and then we leave. Okay.